Hi, my name is Stu Bailey. I am the co-founder and chief enterprise AI architect at ModelOp. ModelOp provides a best-in-class enterprise model production solution called ModelOp Center. For the past 5 years, we've been focused on the large enterprise, often highly regulated industries. And specifically, ModelOp Center addresses the wide variety of problems around the operationalization of AI and ML models as they impact existing business and technical processes. For example, in the areas of compliance and risk management, which we'll be talking about today, as well as technical processes such as SecOps, IT ops, and DevOps, and importantly, modeling processes such as data science. With that, let me hand it over to today's guest, HP, to introduce himself.
Thanks, Stu. Yeah, my name is HP Bunaes. I'm a 30-year veteran of banking, all of it in data and analytics. I've headed up risk data and analytics at some of the country's largest banks and developed models around credit decisioning, pricing, portfolio management, stress testing, reserve adequacy, loss forecasting, all that stuff. I've done a lot of work in applied AI and the use of machine learning in all aspects of banking, from credit to financial crime to marketing and client experience. So this is an area that is near and dear to my heart.
That's great, HP. We're really, really excited to have you, and I think everyone will really benefit from your experience in this area. The topic today is developing an operational framework for AI models. So I have a few questions, and I think we'd just love to hear your experience and your thoughts around some of these questions, if that's okay, HP.
Thanks. Yeah, love to.
Okay. So the first question is, what are some of the big challenges or concerns that the heads of AI initiatives and other executives in large organizations have when it comes to risk associated with AI models?
Yeah, great question. So there was always the risk around proper testing and validation prior to implementation. And I think most organizations have gotten pretty good at that. Making sure that they're using the right data and they're properly testing and validating models prior to their implementation. But what I've seen is a lot of struggles in getting models sort of out of the lab and into the field, and making sure that they're adopted and that they're integrated into the business process, and that they're used as sort of the normal course of business. And that, you know, they're continuously improved and continuously monitored and managed appropriately. What I hear from model risk management people these days is that they're increasingly concerned about what happens after the fact, after models are implemented. You know, they need to be continuously monitored. To make sure that performance doesn't degrade, that data hasn't drifted, that there's continuous change in the data, in the IT environment, in the external environment, and that models need to be continuously managed to ensure that they are performing at the level that you want, and that they are continuously improved as the situation changes both internally and externally.
Yeah, that makes sense, HP. In fact, that really does match our experience as well. I mean, we've been, and Gartner has published a lot of research on that gap, kind of the two things you pointed out, both the gap in just getting models into business, like the length of time it takes. And as you know, these models often have relatively short shelf lives in terms of their value that they can add if they're not in business. So, you know, that's kind of been striking in the large enterprise at how long it takes a model to get into business. Some call it like model debt, you know, models that are building up, they've been validated. Everyone's very confident they'll produce some results, but they just can't get into business. So that growing model debt and all the various aspects of why that is, you know, and I think that is a deep concern that we've seen. And then exactly what you said, that kind of what seems to be emerging is how to integrate that into existing processes for management, governance, and ongoing monitoring is something that large organizations are struggling with. And again, I'd point to Gartner. They have a lot of research now in the emerging area of model ops to really focus on that integration or bridging that gap between the model creation or model development and actually getting them into business. And I think you are right on the money in terms of where organizations should be focusing in terms of getting more models into business and having them appropriately governed so they can be monitored appropriately, and also audits can be done, and they can really create the safety framework for getting more and more impact of AI and ML into the business. So I really couldn't agree more. That kind of is a good, I think, segue to the second question, which is, what should a model operational framework include to ensure good operational and management practices and processes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would sort of start by saying, in a lot of organizations that have been working on developing and implementing models for many years, decades in many cases, there's a challenge in knowing sort of all of the analytics that have been developed and implemented over a long period of time. And a lot of organizations, honestly, don't know the full extent of their analytics. I had one chief analytics officer tell me a story about discovering an overdraft model embedded so deeply in the deposit system that nobody knew it was there, never mind how it worked. I think that analytics have been embedded in so many different lines of business and functions that, and in some cases they're sort of deployed and forgotten about, that, very few organizations really have a complete inventory of all of the analytics that have been developed and implemented, never mind how well they're actually working right now. So, if I were to describe sort of what does a model operational framework look like, number one, you have to know where it all is, and what it does, sort of what data it's using, what predictions are being created, and how those are being consumed downstream. Sort of all the metadata around the models. Once you sort of know where all those models are and what they're doing, right, you have to watch them, right? You've got to monitor both the incoming data as well as the outgoing predictions for potential issues, right? Data changes over time, and I had one credit analytics guy tell me that a key piece of data for credit modeling sort of disappeared one day from the data stream, and nobody knew it, right, until sort of crazy results were coming out of a model. You have to watch these things continuously and make sure that the input data doesn't change and the predictions don't drift over time. Or accuracy begins to degrade because things have changed. So, the framework has to include, number one, a complete view of where all those models are, a view of what they all are, what data they're using, what predictions they're creating, and regular monitoring of what they're doing and what results are being produced and the quality of the incoming data that's being used.
Yeah, I mean, that really matches our experience. Those are the exact requirements that have been driving our features and the value for ModelOp Center, our software model operational platform. Number one, as you said, is that production model inventory that doesn't just include those models that have regulatory oversight, but all models that are feeding scores and inferences to real decisioning processes firm-wide. And that really allows for firm-wide governance and compliance and risk to see, as well as for the firm-wide technical community to know exactly which models are dependent on which business processes and how to attend to them in their operational life cycle. And then I think you really touched on the other thing that's really driven kind of the features into our operational platform, ModelOp Center, which is the life cycle concept for a model. Models are a thing, an enterprise asset, and they have a complex life cycle that includes both business and technical challenges that need constant monitoring and the ability to audit very clearly for accountability and responsibility exactly where models are in their life cycle and where they have been and how they're performing today. So I think that is a kind of a transformative approach for larger enterprises where models have tended to kind of tuck into the business units and be business units assets unless they have some regulatory accountability, and then some subset of those become part of a firm-wide compliance or risk management process. But now in kind of the age of AI, we have so many models that are so intimately involved with so many decisioning processes that we really have to think of all models as business assets and have very well and clearly defined life cycles that can be fully automated on those. So, I really couldn't agree more. And you really bring up an important in your example about the missing data, and I think that brings up frames the next question, which is how should we think about data with respect to operational platforms for models? That comes up, is this just an extension of data ops? There's been a data first kind of trend in the large enterprise for over a decade now. But models are really decisioning assets that use data. So how should we consider data usage and data quality and predictions of models, accuracy, traceability, those types of things with respect to an operational framework around models?
Yeah, the critical point here, I think, is the transition, from the lab into the field. And what I've seen happen in so many organizations is that the analytics group or the data scientists that create the models end up sort of being the owner operators of those models. And, they're continuing to source the data and continuing to produce the results and feed those downstream. That's a mistake. I think that, data scientists, that's not the part of the job that is sort of the high value add aspects, and they really want to spend their time on developing new capabilities rather than maintaining existing capabilities. They're not typically the skill set that's really going to understand sort of operational risk management and production engineering. That's just not in their wheelhouse. So effectively transitioning those models into a sort of hardened production environment is critical. And that means, having IT involved. It means having, the chief data officer and the data engineers involved, and making sure that the ongoing sourcing of the data has been properly engineered with the right controls around it, and that it's integrated into the production environment in a way that can be monitored both operationally in terms of at service levels, but also can be monitored in terms of ongoing quality, both of the incoming data and of the outgoing predictions. So often you see even subtle changes in the incoming data can have dramatic effects on the outgoing results. Unexpected holes in the data, anomalies in the data, combinations of data that's never been seen before, new data that suddenly appears because maybe a new product was added to a system, or a new market was entered by the company, and all of a sudden new data is coming in that the model's not been trained on. these are things that you have to watch for. Same thing on the output side. Obviously, you have to look at accuracy, where ground truth can be known, right? Where do you have false positives? Where do you have false negatives? Are you getting the right trade-off, right, in terms of where errors are very costly versus where errors may be more tolerable, right? In fraud, for example, right, a false positive may be annoying, but a false negative is really, really awful, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to continuously balance and tune the models, and perhaps develop new models for a certain segment where you're seeing accuracy fall off. And you need to monitor for drift over time. One of the things that I've heard from, both credit people and financial crime people, for example, is that, these models are gamed, right? That over time people figure out what, you're looking for and what you're detecting, and they they'll figure out what values, for example, will lead to a good credit decision, or which, things will not be detected in a fraud or money laundering type situation. So you have to sort of stay one step ahead and continuously monitor, improve models over time. With potentially rebuilding models, retraining models, increasing the granularity of models. But it really requires, I think, an effective partnership between the analytics groups, the traditional IT groups, and the chief data officer, the data engineers, and the business units. And that's something that I think is, it's not something that exists today in most organizations. It has to be created.
Yeah, yeah, that's I think you bring up two areas that are very well understood by practitioners like yourself, but not generally appreciated by the organization at large. One is that each model is so complex and unique. It's derived from proprietary data or proprietary business knowledge, and usually some combination of both. Is very sensitive, as you said, to small perturbations in data. Generally speaking, or often can be. It could be very sensitive to even a point change in some linear algebra library. So it can also be numerically sensitive on the technical stack as well. And it's really intimately tied in the AI initiatives into core decisioning, as you mentioned. Like, hey, we could be facing, if we get some part of the operations wrong, we could be facing the wrong way on a very big trade, for example. And so, again, this is well understood by people like yourself who've been doing this for a number of years, but not always well appreciated, that these are not like other assets, like software application assets, or large databases. That models have this kind of complexity and uniqueness and intimate relationship with the business that really requires some new attention from the corporate level. And I would say that brings up a central question, which is, who owns the model operational framework? I mean, is this something that risk management group is responsible for, or who should own this this centralized this capability in general? Should it be centralized? Should be continue to be within business units, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. Well, I'd start by saying not the data scientists themselves. That's probably the worst possible answer. In many financial institutions, there's sort of a 3 lines of defense framework. There are policies around what is required from the people that create the model, particularly around documentation, right? And we all know that data scientists hate doing documentation, but there has to be sort of a mandate, right? That models have to be appropriately documented. And what I've seen work best is sort of a risk-based gradient kind of framework, where, you know, much more documentation and much more testing and much more independent oversight have to be done for the highest risk models, right? Things that will be used for investor disclosure or regulatory purposes, or, you know, in credit decisioning, right? Or in financial crime, right? These things have to be really, really, really well tested, well documented, and independently reviewed. Whereas models, say for marketing purposes, right, may require far less documentation, you know, far less independent review. So one size fits all is never the right answer. And then second, there has to be, you know, sort of an independent model risk management function to make sure that, you know, all of the models have gone through some sort of review prior to implementation, that every model has some sort of monitoring plan to ensure that, you know, it's clear sort of who has responsibility for the ongoing oversight of the operation of that model. And then third, you know, there's a role for sort of operational assurance, right? Auditors, right? To come in and look at, you know, is the documentation complete? Were policies followed? You know, did the right things happen prior to the implementation? Are the models being actively monitored? The second thing I'd say is, you know, the analytics ops function is sort of a new thing, right? And I could argue that creating the right skill set in a central place and kind of, you know, arming them with all the right technology platforms and tool sets would be the best way to go, right? Because then you can build it with the right skills, you can supply them with the right technology, and you can control it all sort of in one place. That might be the right first step. But I think longer term, I think it really, you know, as the saying goes, it takes the village, right? There's a role for traditional IT. There's a role for the chief data office. There's a role for model risk management. And I think that, you know, having a sort of virtual organization that leverages the skill sets embedded in each of those organizations in a sort of a comprehensive framework, I think is probably the best answer. That's harder to do, obviously, than sort of a central organization that you can, you know, kind of build and scale and control in one place. You know, so maybe the answer is you build it centrally first, and then you decentralize it once it's operational, and you get sort of all the right pieces and, you know, the right critters in the right corrals. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, no, that, you know, and that's, in our experience, I think you're really hitting on kind of the key things the key questions that organizations are struggling with. And I think, you know, again, following the Gartner research, the kind of uncertainty here is one of the leading causes for models not getting into production. That there are a few ways to think about it, and it's not always clear, you know, the path forward. What we found in our customer base is emerging, and I think this is happening market-wide as well, is really a partnership between central IT, which really does have the operational experience to operationalize and monitor and audit, you know, complex assets that are critical to the business over a very long period of time, because this time scale for some of these model life cycles is well beyond even maybe a data scientist might have left, and his models is still
absolutely.
So the times operational, really central IT is the only organization that has the visceral experience of the long-term operational excellence. But model risk management has the experience for understanding the impact of models kind of firm-wide with respect to those two. So a kind of a partnership between central IT and model risk management around a keystone capability, exactly as you mentioned, you know, which I think, again, ModelOp seems to be emerging as that kind of keystone capability, in the sense that it can define model life cycles, and in some detail, in, you know, some real detail, and we see a role emerging called the enterprise AI architect that really is responsible for defining those life cycles for models. And it may be, oh, look, in this part of the life cycle, this is where the model risk management system takes over. In this part of the life cycle, this is where we interface with the data, the model factories and the data science platforms, and how to onboard a model into a production inventory. In this part of the life cycle, the model needs to ingest data from data ops. In this part of the life cycle, it's actually running somewhere and producing scores and inferences. So it's has to be running in this cloud for this model because it's close to that application, but the data is coming from this place, which has PII. So that model life cycle becomes kind of a binding framework for how the model interacts with all these existing investments. So it really is a lightweight kind of keystone capability driven by some partnership of MRM and central IT, but really accountable to all of the different organizational components that are responsible for the different parts of the model and in its life cycle. And I think that seems to have materially reduced model debt. It's allowed models to get into business faster and kind of provide a way forward, at least at this time. And I think you're really right, HP, that as AI initiatives continue to have more and more impact on the core decisioning in a business, in a complex large enterprise, it'll be exciting to see how this capability evolves.
Agreed.
So all right, so we're almost out of time here. I mean, and again, I think you've been doing this a long time, and it's really our viewers will really be get a lot out of your perspective on how to guide the organization over time, how to think about these things. I mean, given that AI models and model governance is an evolving area, as we've been talking about, just what do you think a company can do to make sure that they are minimizing risk and kind of addressing regulatory reviews? Because certainly that's going to be more and more scrutinized. We have, how do you think about ethics in AI? How do you think about the evolution of the regulatory landscape? Will some industries that have previously been less regulated be more regulated because of AI decisioning? Kind of what's your views on the long-term impact and what organizations can do today in terms of minimizing risk while embracing AI as being more fundamental to their decisioning process?
Yeah, so interesting topic. The regulatory guidance so far has really been around the front end, around model testing, model validation. I think the regulators' views are evolving, and they're starting to understand that what happens after the fact, with all of the embedded analytics throughout the organization, is equally, if not more important. And I'm guessing that they're going to come out with some, something akin to SR 11.7 around model management and monitoring that will lay out some best practices. And I can sort of guess what's going to be in there, right? I think they're going to clearly say you have to have a complete model inventory. I think they're going to clearly say you have to have a central store of metadata around your models, right? All the documentation. You need to have active monitoring of the incoming data and of the outgoing results. And you have to know where they're going and how they're being used. In many organizations, you have sort of, models upon models upon models, right? The output of one model is used as the input to another model. And so a lot of companies struggle with a slightly different form of technical debt than what you described, which is, the legacy of past practices, right? That may not have been, shall we say, uniformly strong, right? I mean, I've seen models that were created and, the results were distributed in spreadsheets via email, right? I mean, it's, some crazy stuff, right? I mean, people who are under pressure to get things done in time, you know, in a very limited time and a very limited budget, right? They're gonna get creative, right? And they're gonna cut corners, and they're gonna do things expeditiously that you know can come back to haunt an organization, right? And you know, so I think the first thing that you know you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to find all of the analytics. And that's sort of a big, you know, sort of one-time cost that you're going to have to do. One very large bank in the U.S. Did this last summer and found thousands of models that had not been sort of through any formal, you know, central validation and oversight process. So they've got a sort of mitigation plan now, right, to go through those models and to, you know, categorize them according to risk, to make sure that the documentation in place, to make sure they understand what data is being used, where the predictions are going. But I think that's number one. And then, you know, second, you have to make sure that all of that documentation is collected and organized and stored somewhere. And there are going to be holes, and you're going to have to figure out where those holes are, and you're going to have to fill them in. And then you're going to have to make sure that there's ongoing monitoring and model management, especially around change management. I have seen more models fail because of poor data change management than for any other reason. So, you know, having that process in place is going to be critical. And last, unfortunately, it's not good enough just to have that all that process in place, right? You have to be able to prove it, right? So when an auditor or a regulator walks in, right, and they say, well, you know, where are all your analytics, you know, in place, and what are they doing, and how are they being used, and what data is being consumed? You know, you have to be able to sort of hand over, right, and say, all right, here's a report of the full model inventory. Here's all the data being used for each model. Here's all the results that are being produced. Here's who's consuming them. Here's how we monitor each one. Here are, you know, sort of the list of data anomalies we've seen over the last quarter. Here's our issues list. Here's what our remediation plans are for all those issues. You know, if they're convinced that you have a robust process in place and they've seen the artifacts that demonstrate that process is working, you're in good shape, right? Even if the issue list is long, right? At least you have a process in place, and you can demonstrate that you know what your issues are and you have a mitigation plan around those issues. You know, where auditors and regulators get, you know, nasty, right? is where you can't demonstrate those things, right? So, you know, in that case, they're going to go and turn over every rock, right? And, you know, they're going to come up with a lengthy list of, you know, issues requiring management attention, and it's not going to be fun. You know, you're far better off being able to demonstrate that you have a process, you know where your issues are, you have a mitigation plan in place, and, you know, then typically they'll say, okay, good, we got it. We'll come back in, you know, 6 months or a year, and we'll see how you're doing against your plan. But that's a far better outcome, right, than you know, not knowing, right? You know, they always tend to like that you have a process in place, you know what your issues are, you have a plan to address them, then, you know, you just don't know. That's sort of the worst and most risky situation from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that really highlights one of the biggest reasons large enterprises purchase ModelOp Center. That's what we've seen is they've had they ran some process, just like you mentioned, and they're like, holy cow, there are all these models that are actually in business that, you know, weren't approved, haven't gone through regulation, and so they
using God knows what data.
Yes, and so they start on this journey for you know, really rigorously operationalizing these AI initiatives. So yeah, it's really true. Well, HP, this has been tremendous. You know, I think again, the whole industry is exciting as these AI and ML technologies impact and disrupt these large enterprises. You know, I think it will be exciting to participate and watch this evolution with you, given your deep experience in this area. So I think we're just at the beginning here. So I look forward to continuing this conversation as things evolve.
Thank you, Stu. Enjoyed talking to you.
All right, thanks, HP.